I'm Craig Timm, and for the first time, we have a live ACAMS Live. So we are coming to you today from the Assembly in Amsterdam, live right here on LinkedIn and live right here at the conference. Really excited about this. As always, for those of you on LinkedIn, feel free, please, say hello in the chat. Let us know where you're tuning in from. I've got my, so I'm not like doing other things. I got my phone. I'll try to loop in and watch as we're going here. If you've got questions, submit those. Really excited about this topic today. It's something I know we're all passionate about. We're just over 2 months from the Summer Olympics in Paris, and I have to say that is one of my favorite sporting events. You've got 3 passionate sports fans here, but more and more, the sports that we love are running into all sorts of variations of financial crime, and it is infecting from large organizations to local clubs. The intersection between financial crime and sports is just becoming more and more apparent. And of course, the bribery and corruption, those make the headlines, but just as potentially risky things like terrorist financing, money laundering, fraud. We're here today in the Netherlands, and just in the last couple weeks, a Dutch football club from the top tier was actually demoted to a tier below. So from the top tier down for undisclosed connections to Russian oligarch Roman Abramovich. Just another 2 weeks ago, I think the head of football in Zambia was charged with money laundering. So it's really, no matter where you are in the world, this is becoming an issue, and ones that increasingly governments are looking at, both from help from the private sector and imposing more requirements. So I've got 2 world-class experts with me today to walk us through this landscape. Really excited about that. So first, immediately on my left is Dan Benisty. He's Western Union's head of compliance for Northern Europe. He's based in Paris and a member of the ACAMS chapter board in Paris. Side note, they have a really great chapter with really big events. So you should definitely check out those 2. If you're in France, join the chapter. Former French presidents, like really impressive events that Dan puts together. But importantly for this conversation, he's been engaged with his colleagues, public and private sector, leading up to the Olympics about all the potential risks that come with an event like that. So we'll definitely dig into that. Next to Dan is Nick Raudenski. He's an independent consultant with Raudenski Integrity Sports Consulting, but formerly served in senior integrity roles in FIFA and UEFA. He's the former head of intelligence and investigations at the International Testing Agency. And then before that, was in U.S. government law enforcement with Homeland Security. So we've got hopefully the whole spectrum for you covered today. And so Dan and Nick, thanks for being here.
Thank you so much.
All right, so let's dive in and let's start. Let's start with, we're in Europe. Let's start with Paris. Let's start with the Olympics. I talked a little bit about all the potential financial crime angles that come with the biggest event in the world, right? And so you're right in the middle of it. Give us an idea of what are the threats you're thinking about? What's the government thinking about? 2 months out, we're getting pretty close.
Yeah, thank you so much, Craig, and very happy for this first live. As you said as an introduction, Olympics is a global event. It's 57 consecutive days for this event. And I think before going to the financial crime risk, just like few figures to understand what is this event. So it's 4 billion viewers worldwide. It will be more than 600,000 spectators on the opening ceremony. 6,000 journalists, more than 100 foreign dignitaries. It will be also 1,000 athletes, 15 million tourists, more than 1,500 volunteers. When you say that, you immediately understand that it's an unparalleled visibility for France, which implies very, very high risk exposure for the damage of the image of France. It's not like we are not going to hide. We are here like at the Assembly for Financial Crime Expert. It's one of the higher risk for terrorism. It has been like officially said by the President of France, by the Prime Minister, that very recently they decided for the regulatory environment to increase the level of national security because of the threat of the Olympics. We were discussing about that no longer than 2 weeks ago They arrested like a young person in terms of KYC. It's interesting, very young profile, almost minor.
Wow.
That was influenced by one of the threat, that was like, they found like some information in his laptop, in his like exchange, that he was like planning to do something. So we all know that Olympics is great. As you said, like we are passionate about like sport, and Olympics is like, I think like the highest events, like the greatest events of sports. And at the same time, France is under the pressure of this type of threat. Very quickly, we do have like three types of threat. The first one that is official, because like they like also to communicate, is Islamic terrorism. So they officially, send the message that France is on the top targets, and they influence the fact that during like this great event, as I said, 57 days, billions of euros, they want to have like potentially something that would happen, which implies like a security that is like will be like maybe like the most important level of security. Not only this one, we have three threats. We have the second one that is ultra-right violent groups and ultra-left violent groups. Different targets. They are not planning to have like a terrorist attack. Like what they are planning is more to have riots or what we call like public disorder actions, to also show during like these huge events, like also their action, what they are working for, what they are also like want to show as a message. Like for instance, for violent ultra left, it's more really related to the movement on environmental issues, For the ultra right, it's a little bit different because it's more linked to some, like fascism movements, and more also coming and influenced by USA, Canada movements, that are very like close to now like Europe. So they have different targets. I'm not going to list like all the targets. It's to be too long. But the thing, and that's also the conclusion of this first part, is that the Olympics, it's on one side one of the greatest events. On the other side, for financial crime, will be a huge challenge. And we will come later about like as an institution and financial institution and with public and private sector, how we can work on this.
So I think that's a great way to start, with the Olympics, biggest event in the world, probably also means one of the biggest financial crime threats in all sorts of angles. Terrorist financing, a lot of people don't think about it. Money laundering, fraud, you've got all of these different things. And, the Olympics is enormous, but there's plenty of other massive sporting events. Nick used to work for FIFA. Next to the Olympics, it's probably the World Cup, right? If there's another one, right? But then, the risk materializes in all these different ways. You've got the Olympic Committee, you've got FIFA, you've got UEFA, but then you've got small local clubs that risk this stuff too. So I'm wondering, most of our audience will probably be either in government or financial institutions, and they'll be familiar with AML controls at that institution. But maybe just start, having worked at a couple of these places, having worked with colleagues at other places, what's the landscape within a sporting organization? What's within a club? Do they have anything that resembles an AML program? What's the culture like? Like, before we get into some of the later, just set that scene for us.
Sure, thanks very much for the question. I think I can best put this into the context of a quote that I came across a few years ago. It was related to foul play and corruption in sport. And the quote is, "No one is governing the governing bodies." And so this is the time 10 years ago, before FIFA Gate, before some of the major scandals, but there's not that sense of oversight, of regulation on what's happening within sport. Again, to set the scene, many of these sport governing bodies are not-for-profit organizations, are domiciled in Switzerland. So they're kind of operating by their own rules in a lot of senses. So they're very organized, very different from a lot of Fortune 500 companies or companies that we know in a lot of different sectors. And they're not subject to the same oversight or the same regulations that we would be accustomed to. And so to set the scene a little bit is to say it sometimes, at least historically, has been a little bit like the Wild West, right? They organize themselves, they govern themselves. Their responsibility is for rules on the field, on the court, on the pitch. But now we're talking about the stuff that's happening off the court, off the field. And so what they had is really nothing like what anything looks like in an AFC program, right? They don't have that mentality. They're not looking for suspicious transactions. They're not looking at things with the level of scrutiny that we would or that we have become accustomed to looking for. And so this again mirrors a lot about the evolution of AFC programs. Craig, you and I were talking. This looked a lot differently 20 years ago, before 9/11, before these progressions have happened. There's been 20 years of scrutiny, of fines for big
supervision, to your original quote, right?
There's been supervision. There's been investigations. Now there are compliance officers. Now there are compliance summits. There's oversight. There's a lot more work on things like sanctions, right? Carrot and stick. So in this new, what I call a niche sector of sports, it takes a little bit of time for them to come on board. I've always said that it's been about 15 to 20 years behind how, let's say, normal businesses have been run. And I love this quote, and I wanted to just make sure that I get it right. This is a quote from the European Commission on the risk assessment of football as a new sector. Professional football's complex organization and lack of transparency have created fertile ground for the use of illegal resources. Questionable sums of money with no apparent or explicable financial return or gain are being invested in sports. And so just sitting with that quote a little bit, looking from a risk perspective, right? Vast amount of money that's flowing through sports, the cross-border movement of sports figures, of transfers, of transactions. We're really looking at extraterritorial threats to what's happening in a sector that has been regulated and now into one that's been limited or lightly regulated in the past, right? And some of these scandals have really shown the underbelly of sport. You see these scandals, you hear of FIFA Gate, you hear of some of the scandals that we've gone through in sport. But to shine how it's looking right now, there's a lot more development on the compliance regime, right? I'm not going to say that there's an AML or a CT view, but it's a lot more on compliance, a lot more on vendors, due diligence on transactions of services. So, they're advancing, but again, it's 15 to 20 years behind. They're now having, compliance summits. They're now having compliance organizations, units within their organization that are looking at this. But again, that's not on the financial transactions. That's not on the DBOs. That's not on what's happening behind it. They're just looking at vendors. So when we come to these major sport events, major international events, right, there's billions in contracts. There's billions in the delivery of the events. So they're looking at the delivery of commercial services. They're not looking at what's behind that. And I can throw out a few things that puts this into perspective. Conflict of interest for procurement of services. They're not looking at the development of the infrastructure, these white elephants, the setup of these arenas that get used for the big organization and then don't get used beyond that. We talked a little bit about the ticket schemes, right? Getting access to tickets to these major organizations. That has a huge amount of value on the black market. And so looking behind what's happening in some of the financial crime areas is very much a useful sector. And I just want to finish with one quote on this topic. This unfortunately happened from a senior official. And he said that he was organizing a major competition. And he said how easy it was to organize one of these major competitions in an authoritarian regime. In democratic regimes, people are looking at the transactions. They're looking at what's behind. They're complying with what the mostly Western culture, Western countries have to deal with. But in authoritarian regimes, nobody's asking that question. Nobody's asking where the money's coming from. And so from keeping in mind what the purpose of sport organizations are to organize competitions, not to identify suspicious transactions, right? So it's then that mentality that they're not yet there with having to ask those questions, asking the uncomfortable thing, where did that investment come from? Where did the money behind sport come from?
And that's actually the beauty of sport, right? That it brings the world together, that like people who do not have diplomatic relations can run against each other on a track, right? Like that's what we love about it. But this new angle is now, changing that. And I think you've highlighted the growing recognition of it. When I think about what changed banking, it was enforcement actions and supervision, right? We've started to have some enforcement actions. You've seen, the French government did some stuff around the doping scandal. People went to jail, like really serious things. FIFA's had their sort of legal issues too. And so now one of the big topics here in Amsterdam is, as part of the new EU AML package, AML requirements are coming to football in Europe. Now, what exactly that means is still left to be determined. That's some of the stuff in the new package is mandatory, some is not. So maybe, Nick, you can get into a little bit of that. But if you're telling me the major organizations are struggling with this, that's sort of what I hear reading between the lines. I imagine the local football club doesn't know what to do. So maybe set the landscape in terms of this new AML package, the new requirements, and what do the clubs do?
Yeah, I think it's going to be, we have to be very clear, and I think it was highlighted in one of the sessions here in person. It's going to be very challenging, right? There's going to be a big shift in what some of the requirements are, and some of the requirements of complying with this new directive. They're not doing this at the moment, and that's the important thing to make sure. It's going to need its time to continue to progress. There's going to be people dragging their feet and saying, why do we have to do this? Why is this part of a bigger challenge that we have? But it's not only in far off parts of the world. We're talking about within Europe. They're still not asking the questions. Where's the money coming from? How are they set up to really conduct due diligence? Set up. And I think that's evident by the guidance that was put out regarding the AML directive. Everybody has 3 years to implement this, but they've given the football sector or the football clubs, the agents, the associations 5 years. And that really puts it into perspective how much work needs to happen in the background, preparing them, what needs to happen. They're not like financial institutions that they're used to reporting SARs, reporting suspicious transactions, flagging transactions for further due dil. Football is big business, and that's what's clear. We have to realize how much money is really flowing through, and how little we really know about where some of those financial transactions are coming from. I wanted to shift a little bit to the development of football and the development programs in sports. There's a lot of money being reinvested. Again, as I mentioned, there's a not-for-profit entity related to the organization of sports. So they can't just sit on these troves of money. They push that back out to the associations, push that back out to the country. But then there's not that regulation of what happens with the money. There's one example that I can give that shows this potential for embezzlement, for misappropriation. A country not to be named was given a substantial amount of money to build football fields, a full football complex. The organization then came several years later to look at the development, and they saw an empty lot. Nothing was built. The land ownership had changed hands. Nothing that was supposed to be invested in the sport development actually happened. The money walked away. And so, when we think about how the world of good that sport does in reinvesting in the development at the grassroots level, there are also those actors that see that as a criminal opportunity to walk away with that development. I want to finalize with the topic of some of the pushback from sports sectors on these new directives, right? And I think I just want to highlight that I feel that there was some pushback because they think, well, we're responsible for sport, let us be in charge. And what you've seen in the past 10, 20 years is that they haven't been policing their own backyard. And now you have a regulator. Now you have somebody coming and saying, this is the directive that you have to comply with. And now people are getting a little bit nervous. Well, what does that mean? And that goes to show the need for regulation, the need for oversight. In England, there's currently a push on a football regulator. And again, some people think that they're not going far enough to look at financial transactions. But again, this need to shift towards oversight and regulations because there's been significant problems. Opaque investors, nobody knowing where the money's coming from, marketing deals from Asian gambling sectors that nobody knows what really exists behind them. They're emblazoned across the shirts. And then you go to look at, well, what is that? And it doesn't exist. It's an offshore company. It's unregulated, but it's on our screens. It's on our TVs, every weekend. And nobody knows what's behind it. And so really that shift to starting to check what's happening, where the financial flows are coming from, and who's behind some of this financial investment is really what we're going to see in the next couple of years.
Right. We do not have like a crystal ball, but this new AML pack and the fact that there's a focus on the sport world and the football world, as you said, it's going to be a huge challenge, like a huge challenge. It's not the mindset. We can go even deeper, but there's a lot of conflict of interest, political games between states.
Because a lot of these clubs may be PEPs, right? They may be politically exposed persons, right? Yeah,
they
right.
Are all PEPs. Most of them, like the big, like clubs, are all PEPs. But also something that we can think about that could be like totally crazy is also like the consequences between sports and bigger economy market. When you have the Qatar that will invest in the sport clubs, it's also like a signal to say, I do invest in the sport clubs, but I will do invest in all the other economy. So it's a win-win situation.
But don't ask me where the money comes from.
And don't ask me where the money comes from. And then also do not supervise me. So there will be like a huge challenge, as you say, about like 3 to 5 years. We all know that in Europe, like even like in the former like directive, that you always have like some discrepancies, because when you have an AML pact, then after each country needs to interpret and then adopt their own laws. What is like the greatest things about like compliance and AML around the globe is that there's few discrepancies. Like the FATF has like some recommendation and the Europe, and there's very few discrepancies between country to country. And that's why we can work a little bit like around the globe. For these topics, country to country, I would be very like curious to imagine how like each
There's no
country,
consensus.
No, I cannot imagine how England, which is even out of Europe, but that will be pressure on England. But for instance, Italy, Spain, and France, where the clubs are like on the top of the top, how they are going to interpret like this. And also because in fact, like at the end, like as you said, like we need to supervise. So how will the regulator will be empowered to do like an exam, such as like a financial institution? We have like the regulator exam during like 3, 4, 5, 6 months, and how they are going to be empowered to sanction them. That's a lot of question that the AML pack is there. 3 to 5 years, like to implement, like I think like a first genesis, like starting mindset, but it will take like, I think like 10 to 15 years.
Well, and one thing, if history tells us anything, when you've got an identified risk in a not regulated or lightly regulated sector, often the government and the supervisors will look to the financial institutions. You guys could do something about it, right? So for the folks out there who you might have now scared, like what is a financial institution? How do you think about this? What sort of things can you look for? How do you, because in the interim, before that gets built up, a lot of those questions are going to fall on you as sort of a pseudo regulator and pseudo imposing these requirements on your customers.
So to the direct topic, like about football or whatever, I cannot, like as I said, I do not have a crystal ball. I cannot tell you what I will do because for the moment it's not yet implemented. Maybe back to the first topic about the Olympics.
Yeah, of course.
So we were talking about public-private sector and exchange. We do have in Paris like a committee that discuss this topic with the Intel, with the different financial institution, the most important financial institution, and we come all together about how we can anticipate, how we can mitigate the risk. For all the AML experts that are in Amsterdam or in the live, we know that we do have the obligation to have a risk classification. risk mapping. But to have a risk mapping means that we need to identify a scheme and a scenario. For the Olympics, it will be totally crazy because it goes, as you said, in all directions. It will be like money laundering, it could be corruption, ticketing. There were a lot of journalists that were talking about like also the risk of Airbnb because a lot of tourists will come, the risk of like having like issues with, renting. So it goes in all directions. As a head of compliance, when I'm in front of my risk classification, I cannot create like a scenario just for that. It will be totally crazy. So that's the basic things. If you start from there, you do not have a scenario. The next step is after the scenario is the rules and the alerts. So question is like, do we have specific rules to target the Olympics threat? No. For the moment, we do not.
Yeah.
But the thing is that when we are discussing with the public sector, the Intel, and the other financial institution is we do have a lot of rules that already target some scenario. It means that potentially we can adapt some of the rules, maybe for a threshold, for some of the KYC profile that we could have from the Intel. So that's also part of the exchange between the public and the private sectors, or private, and potentially like look at the last step after the rules when it generates an alert. So how the compliance analyst will look at these alerts during this period of time, maybe differently with another eyes from like business as usual alerts. That will be the challenge.
So it's training our teams in part to be aware of this risk, to think about it, right? We need to make sure our teams are aware of this and that they're thinking about it, because we can't design a solution for it, but just creating that awareness might lead them to find it.
Let me give you an example, a concrete example, more than just like, like high level, like information like this that people can understand. I was talking with that's very interesting. I was talking with one of my counterparts, like of this like public-private like committee that is working for crowdfunding industry. And he was telling me that in his scenario, in general, in the crowdfunding, they are using hashtag. So when you are creating, like something like for an anniversary or whatever, they will use, different words of the hashtag during the Olympics to potentially target some fraudulent or money laundering activity. For instance, related to the ticketing. That was talking about the ticketing. So how we can they can create potentially like a crowdfunding, just like for reselling like ticketing, which will be like totally forbidden, So the crowdfunding, like we can use that, I was talking also with someone on crypto. So how like the crypto could be involved in some scheme on like black market or things like this, to use like a different currency or different crypto for potentially like some terrorism scheme, more than like in financial institution where we will have the monitoring, So that's the challenge. As you say, like the public-private sector and the private sector is in the committee that we have is also like key to exchange the information, to exchange the intelligence, to have the best practices. We do not have rules for the moment. We do not have scenario. We know that we need to adapt our scenario, to adapt our rules, because we will have to mitigate the risk.
Yeah,
for sure.
Well, we're getting close to the end of our time here. We've talked a lot about the bad, and I want to end on a positive note because I still love sports, and I think for all the reasons we talked about, sports is one of the few things that brings us together as a world, right? And it's so important. And yes, they're bad, and yes, we'll tackle those, but it's mostly still great. And so, Nick, you were, one who's been able to combine your love of fighting financial crime and your love of sports together. This is sounding like a burgeoning industry out there for people, who maybe are sitting there and be like, boy, I love AML, I love sports. There's all of this need. Tell us a little bit about your experience. What has it been like, and what advice would you have for folks out there who are like, I think I want to go work at my favorite football club?
Yeah, no, thanks very much for the question. And it's exactly what we were talking about before. It was combining your Monday through Friday, your day job, quote unquote, with what you love to do on the nights and weekends. You come home, you watch a game, you travel to a game, you go see things, you follow the news, and putting those two things together for me as an investigator was what I thought was a dream job. And I caveat that with what I thought, because, there's a quote certainly in America, but like, be careful what you wish for, right? Because sometimes you see how they make the sausage and you're not so like happy with what you're eating, right?
It's like politics. There are things that sometimes it's better from a distance.
Right. And so that's the thing. You see this thing on TV or you see this thing in a stadium, and then you see how it's made. You see how it actually operates. You see the people that are behind it that don't have the sport's best interest. And I'm not talking about all people. There are a lot of positive people promoting change, using sport for what it's supposed to do. But there are also those that are using it to exploit for financial benefit, for their own gain. Their own gain. I always give a quote anytime I'm asked this question, and it comes from the movie The Matrix. If anybody's seen it, right? He gives them the opportunity of the red pill or the blue pill. And the blue pill, you continue to believe what you want to believe, and everything's fine and perfect, right? And so you don't see sports. You continue to follow the great storylines and the fandom and the passion. But if you take the red pill, you see how deep the rabbit hole really goes. And it's great to combine these two things, but you also should have your eyes open on sometimes the organizations aren't as committed as you are. They're not set up like law enforcement. They're not set up like financial institutions. They know that there's commercial conflicts there with these scandals, and maybe we don't want to publicize this. Maybe we want to, sort of look the other way. That's not our job. That's the job of the regulator. So this development of this niche area, and for investigators and for compliance professionals, is going to be a really good opportunity in the future for combining those two passions. Because at the end of the day, you have to ask yourself, why do you do what you do? And it's to devote to that cause, to try to make better change for the better good, to make the situation, make the thing that you love, sports, to operate better, to be more transparent, to not be the target of financial crime. And so that's really why we wake up every day to do what we do.
So I have to ask, are you happy you took the red pill? Like, you dove down the hole. Like, would you do it again?
Hesitating.
It's a heck of a question. But yeah, I'm doing it every time. I'm fighting for the better, for the positive good, because we see things like this. We see the EU directives. We see people trying to change and realizing, hang on a second, it's been governed how it's been governed. We need to change. We can't let FIFA Gate happen. We can't let marketing schemes happen. We can't let bribery and corruption. I was talking to a very close friend, and I said, how is it really on the ground right now? Said before, everything was under the table. Now it's on top of the table, because they know they have to register it. It can't be, so hidden. So now it's for our responsibility to check on the legit transactions, how things are really happening, to dig a little bit further. So, it's going to be a very fascinating development.
I mean, I think that being early is hard. Like, for those of you who are in crypto out there, you probably realize the same thing. Like, it is hard being early. But what I've heard is that there's tremendous opportunity. There's now growing willingness of something that needs to be done from governments, from everybody else. And, now, at least in the EU, like it or not, you're going to be dragged along. So it will continue to get better. And I think, on that optimistic note of, there's people out there. I hope some of you take the red pill. Go into it. We need good people, right? Like, I love sports. I don't want to see, no Olympics, right? I don't want to see these things. So Dan and Nick, thank you so much for being here today. I really appreciate it. I really appreciate all of you for tuning in. Thank you very much for watching, for those live and on replay. And we will see you next time on ACAMS Live.